like a contratenor.
All right.
Um, so great. So thank you all for coming out this morning here in the States, particularly those on the West Coast. It is quite early, so I appreciate that you've all rolled out of bed for what promises to be a really excellent talk today. I've been a big fan of Dr. Hanieh's work for some time, particularly in his writings on petrochemicals, the financialization of oil, or so-called financialization of oil. Um, and I was just so thrilled that when I asked if he would give a lecture here today, he actually said yes, and we are doing it. Um, so without further ado, I'm going to read you his bio and then turn it over to Dr. Hanieh. And there should again be some time at the end for questions. So think about those during the talk. I think we can have a really nice discussion here at the end, and I can moderate that. Um, so Adam Hanieh is currently the professor of political economy and global development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. And in February 2026, as we just heard, he will be moving to SOAS, University of London, to take up a new role as the director of the SOAS Middle East Institute. Um, he's also a research fellow at the Transnational Institute and sits on the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project. Dr. Hanieh is the author of four books, including Money Markets and Monarchies, which won the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. His most recent book, Crude Capitalism, which you should all check out, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, came out on Verso Books in 2024 and was co-winner of the 2025 Best Book by International Scholar Global and Transnational section of the American Sociological Association. So obviously, we're all very lucky today to be here. So without further ado, take it away, Adam.
Wonderful. Thanks, Owen, for that introduction, and again, thanks everyone for making it out today, wherever you might be. I'm just going to share my screen. So I have some slides. Okay. Um, okay, is that clear?
We
Yep.
can see your slides and also your notes. Um, if
Uh,
you don't have notes, but it's in presenter
no.
mode.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure how to switch that. How do I? um, I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I can see the slides all right. Anyone else in the crowd having trouble? Things too small for them, or are we all good?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again, Owen, and for inviting me and everyone for turning out. What I want to talk about today for about 45 minutes or so is based upon an article that I have recently published with Development and Change. And it also incorporates some of the arguments from the book Crude Capitalism that I'll speak to in a second. But essentially, what I want to be looking at is this question of the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies, and their place in the global oil economy, and what at first sight might appear as somewhat of a paradox, in that they are also moving to the question of taking up the question of the energy transition, renewable capacity, expanding renewable capacity, and so forth. So I want to have a look at both the question of the hydrocarbons, but also turning to this question of renewables as well towards the end. So basically, I want to cover, if I can, three major themes in this presentation. I'll begin with looking at this question of oil in global capitalism, and then looking more specifically at the Middle East and the Gulf oil exporters in particular, and then come back to this question of the energy transition, or so-called energy transition in the Gulf, and we'll see what that means in concrete. So, just to begin with this issue of oil, this is based upon the book Crude Capitalism. I'm not sure how many of you have had a chance to look at this, but basically the argument in this book stems from working on the Gulf for many years, but also trying to think about how we should theorize oil within capitalism. The driving motivation, if you like, was a dissatisfaction in the way that oil is often spoken about, where oil is kind of invested with this immense power and is seen as being, if you like, an actor that can change our societies, change the way that we behave. It is given this power, almost this, and a kind of agency, where it is separated from the actual social relations in which we live. We can see this in the kinds of titles often used in books about oil, for example, the famous book *The Prize* by Daniel Yergin. We can see this in terms of terms such as the resource curse and the frameworks such as rentier state theory as a way of kind of trying to explain places like the Gulf and other major export oil and gas exporters, where oil is invested with this power that is divorced from capitalist social relations. So you can see here that I'm making a critique of this approach to oil along the lines of a critique of commodity fetishism, Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, and instead reversing this causality, if you like, because in the end, oil is just simply a sticky black goo. So the question is to ask what it is about the world that we live in, about the social system that we live in, that gives this sticky black goo this apparent power. And the way I approach this in the book is to say, well, if we think about the logics of capitalism, we think about this kind of tendency to endless accumulation, the tendency towards speeding up our both the production and consumption of commodities, mechanization, all of these features of this social system we live under. We can understand the ways in which they give the physical properties of oil such immense importance and invest it with this apparent power. So that's, if you like, the kind of theoretical approach that I begin the book with. And then the rest of the book is to do tries to follow a couple of other themes. One is to think about how the emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel around the middle of the 20th century, after World War II, was intimately connected with the rise of the United States as the dominant capitalist power globally. So to tell, if you like, these two twin transitions, the intersections between these two twin transitions of, number one, oil supplanting coal as the leading fossil fuel, and then secondly, the United States emerging as the dominant world power with the weakening of European colonial former European colonial powers such as Britain and France in the wake of World War II. So to think about the ways in which these two shifts in the world market were connected to one another, reinforced one another. The other side to this, and this I think is again a dissatisfaction with the way that oil is often spoken about, is to place oil in its longer value chain beyond simply the extraction of crude oil. The upstream sector of the oil, crude oil dug coming out of the ground, but actually think about what oil becomes as it circulates through our lives. So to think about oil, for example, through refining, to think about the ways in which oil is connected to the production of petrochemicals. And this is a big emphasis in the book to argue that this shift in the nature of material production and commodity production, which again occurred around the middle of the 20th century, where plastics and other kinds of synthetic materials emerged as really the foundational base of all material production, was deeply connected to oil's emergence as the leading fossil fuel, and reinforced and strengthened the power of oil companies as the kind of arbiters of that process. So the question of petrochemicals, and then the issues of the ways in which oil was bound up with financial circuits, and particularly the rise of the US dollar as world money, again in that post-war period. So, in other words, to really emphasize that oil is needs to be seen beyond the kind of struggle over upstream reserves, and think about the control of oil and its transformation and circulation in our lives. And then finally, this question of energy transitions. What does it mean to think about energy transitions under capitalism? And this I'll come back to this point at the end of the presentation. So that's, if you like, the kind of uh, theoretical approach and some of the themes of the book. But what I want to do, the book is tries to tell this story globally. But what I want to do today is focus in particular on this question of the Gulf states, and I'm going to be speaking in particular about these six states you can see in green on the map: Saudi Arabia, the UAE or United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. These are six monarchies. They're the six Gulf monarchies, or the Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies. They are essential in the historically in the emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel, because it was the extraction of oil from these territories that really underpinned the oil transition, however problematic that term is, and I'll come back to that. Really underpinned the transition in Western Europe in the post-war period, and later at the global scale. Today, these are the largest oil exporters globally, and gas exporters, which again I'll come to some of these dynamics in a second. They are, as I said, all monarchies ruled by hereditary ruling families. They also, very importantly, have specific labor structures that it's important to foreground, in the sense that these states are made up of the labor force in all of these states. These six countries are made up of temporary migrant workers. More than half of the labor force in each of these states are made up of migrant workers who have no viable route to becoming citizens or any kind of permanent residents. They are brought to the region on contracts, and once those contracts are over, they're simply forced to return home. They're concentrated in sectors like construction and retail and all kind of economic areas in the region, and it means that the citizen population in some of these states, we're talking less than 10% of the population actually holds citizenship. It means that these workers, they lack labor rights, they lack the ability to organize in unions or to go on strike or anything like that. They're bound to their employers through the kafala system, this kind of contractual obligation controlled by the employer. And if at any point they engage in protests or strikes or any kind of protest movements, they can legally and simply be deported. And this has happened at numerous points in the history. And what this does actually is set the region apart from other oil exporters in the Middle East and elsewhere, such as Iraq and Iran, two major oil producers and exporters, but where you see a long history of militant trade unions and labor actions connected closely to anti-colonial struggles in the region. So, this issue of I think the kind of class structure, this dependence on a migrant working class, easily deportable and precarious migrant working class, is important to foreground in understanding the place of these states, both in the oil industry globally, but also in American power. And I'll come to that in a second. So, as I said, these states were a major producers of oil in that post-war period. They at that moment and through the early 20th century, oil extraction was under the control of the so-called Seven Sisters, the big seven oil firms that dominated world oil, five American, two European firms that are the forebearers of the big Western firms today, like ExxonMobil and BP, Shell. However, in that post-war period, oil in the region as a whole, as it was globally, was at least the crude upstream element was nationalized, coming under the control of national oil companies in these six states. And the most important of these is Saudi Aramco, which was formerly an American oil company, but today is controlled by the Saudi state. Aramco is by far the largest oil company in the world today. Its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the five largest Western oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Total Energies, BP, and Shell. So we're talking about a massive oil producer, and I just want to highlight Aramco here because its importance I'll come back to in a minute. So uh, there's a lot that can be said, and I don't want to spend too much time on the kind of U.S. relationship with these states, but happy to expand on that perhaps in discussion. But what I do want to look at is some of the changing dynamics of the oil industry and the place of the Gulf within the global trade. So what we see in the last 2 decades is a massive shift in the directionality of the global oil trade, commensurate with the emergence of China as a center of global manufacturing and a center of global capital accumulation. And with that shift, we see China's industrialization and manufacturing emergence. We see a very significant increase in China's consumption of global oil imports. And this table shows the breakdown of key geographies globally. We can see in the early 2000s that 50% of the world's oil imports were going to the United States and Europe. Today, that proportion has shrunk significantly, and China makes up around a fifth of the world's oil trade, despite being itself a major oil producer, actually. And China, along with other East Asian states, probably consume around a third of the world's oil imports globally now. This shift or this emergence of China as a major oil importer was fundamentally dependent upon an eastward shift in the Gulf's oil exports away from Western Europe and the US, which had historically been where the Gulf's oil exports were centered, eastward towards China and wider East Asia. So this is what I've described as an east-east hydrocarbon access that links the Middle East and East Asia through the export of oil. I should also note, because it's very important in terms of understanding the climate emergency and the climate catastrophe that we're living, is that this increase in China's consumption of the world oil trade wasn't a zero-sum game. It's not like Europe and Western Europe, sorry, United States and Europe dropped their oil consumption and that was taken up by China. This was an across-the-board absolute increase in global oil consumption across these 2 decades. In which China's relative share increased, but absolutely global oil consumption increased. And China's emergence into this market was equivalent of about a new US entering the world oil market. So this is very important to highlight because it does show that part of what I'll come back to, this question of energy transitions. So This east-east hydrocarbon axis, just to look at this in a bit more detail, um, it has meant the process that I described earlier around companies like Aramco. We can also talk about the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and other kind of national oil companies in the Gulf have really increased their size and influence because of these linkages with China. But very importantly, they have also followed the path of their Western rivals, such as the big Western firms, those Seven Sisters and others that I spoke about through the early 20th century, in the sense that they have become much more vertically integrated. They've expanded across the value chain, the oil value chain. So if we look at a company like Aramco today, it is not simply an exporter of crude oil. It is also deeply involved in refining, petrochemical production, as well as controlling tanker fleets and marketing routes, and even down to the sale of, owning petrol stations, for instance. In places like China, you see Aramco branded petrol stations in parts of China today. So they're involved in each step of the oil value chain, becoming deeply vertically integrated, as did ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell in earlier histories of the oil industry. So this process of vertical integration is important to emphasize. For instance, if we're talking about petrochemicals, the second largest synthetic rubber producer in the world today is actually Aramco, is owned by Saudi Aramco. It's a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. And you can look at the petrochemical industry more broadly and see the influence of these national oil companies. So this is significant, and I'll come back to this in terms of what it might mean for how we think about the climate policy making and dealing with the climate emergency. So just to unpack some of these figures a little bit further, this is Chinese oil imports. And again, over this 2 decade period, this 2 decade shift or emergence of China, you can see that the Middle East make up around 60%, just under 60% of China's imports. We hear a lot about Russia in this respect, and Russia is significant, but still, as a on a regional basis, we see the Middle East as really key. It is also really important in understanding this to see that this is not simply the export of crude oil from the Gulf to China. It is also the increasing interdependencies along the whole value chain. So if you look, for example, at China's petrochemical industry, there are, state-owned enterprises are important, but there is a significant proportion, about a third of China's petrochemical production, that comes from privately owned petrochemical firms in China. And the biggest foreign actor with numerous joint ventures in China is actually the Gulf. These big Gulf national oil companies, and it is not simply the provision of crude oil to the Chinese petrochemical industry. It's building refineries, it's building port infrastructure, and it's building marketing routes throughout all of East Asia. So we see these interdependencies deepening between the Gulf and China, East Asia in both directions. So likewise, we can see China's Chinese capitals linkages with the oil industry in various ways in the Gulf itself. So these interdependencies, I think, are important to think beyond just simply the export of crude oil. Looking at refining, for instance, this is a a table that looks at the global share of refining capacity. Again, this is needs to be seen as these are relative shares, but it needs to be seen in light of an absolute increase in refining products. But you can see in the early 2000s, just over 40% of the world's refining capacity was located in North America and Europe. Today, China and wider East Asia have overtaken that share of North American and European. The only other region where we've seen a increase in this relative share is the Middle East. And probably today the Middle East is exceeding Europe's share of refining capacity. So again, this is a reflection of this downstream vertical integration of the Gulf oil industry. Some of the biggest refining plants in the world today are being built in the Gulf region. Again, mostly for export to China. Not just crude oil, but also, ethylene and propylene polymers that are the basis of the petrochemical industry as well. So let's, that's kind of the shift. I guess the basic takeaway is this east-east axis that has emerged in the industry. But I want to now turn a little bit to thinking about more broadly, what do these states, the Gulf states, think about oil and gas production more generally, and then come to these questions of renewables. So the first thing, which is terrifying, to put it bluntly, a terrifying proposition, is that these states have no intention of moving away from oil and gas production. In fact, it's the opposite. They are all pledging to accelerate their production of hydrocarbons. The Saudi oil minister said a few years ago, every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. And if you look concretely at their plans, they are talking about ramping up oil and significantly gas production, LNG production, over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years or so. Gas is significant here because Qatar is already a major gas producer, LNG, but all of the other states, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, are also significantly moving into LNG production, which of course is major greenhouse gas. Methane is a major greenhouse gas. Is part of why I'm describing this as a terrifying proposition. So there is no intent of lessening or walking away from this. Just as an aside, of course, this is not simply reducible to the Gulf. Western firms in recent months even, have made similar pledges, but I think the Gulf is important because of its status as a major, the most important zone of exports globally. And to emphasize the point that these are not just speculative plans. They come with investment. They come with concrete results on the ground. So they're backed by this kind of bigger, exploration and expansion of refining and all sorts of things. So this is one side. There is no move away. In fact, exactly the opposite, the acceleration of oil and gas in the Gulf. However, we have this apparent paradox, and we can see here the expansion of renewables, solar and wind in particular, but also batteries in the Gulf region as well. And this might initially seem as somewhat of a contradiction with what I said just a second ago. In fact, if you take the Middle East as a whole, if you take the global expansion of renewables outside of China, which, as everyone is, I'm sure, familiar, is the major kind of zone of expansion. But if you remove China from the equation, the Middle East is actually the fastest growing area of renewable capacity globally. And this is primarily because of the Gulf states, who are rolling out these kinds of schemes, solar, wind, battery, at a fairly at a rapid rate. They now hold, these 6 states, the majority of solar and wind capacity in the whole of the Middle East. If you go back just 6 years, they were a very small proportion of the region's renewable capacity. So it's been a rapid increase in this kind of capacity. And you can see in the final column of this table, just how rapid that has been compared the figures of 2024 with those of 2018. You can see a very significant increase in renewable capacity. This has been accompanied by, various pledges about reduction in emissions, and the share of electricity that is pledged to come from renewables. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is talking about half of its electricity by 2030, faster than some European states in this respect. So, how do we understand this expansion? Now, I think the most straightforward way of thinking about this relationship actually comes from the Saudi oil minister, who said a few years ago that when asked about, why is it that you're plowing this money and into these kinds of solar and wind projects, he said, we see it as a triple win. And what did he mean by this? Well, the first thing to really foreground, the first way in which these states are thinking about this expansion is connected to the production of electricity in the Gulf. The Gulf states have seen, alongside the expansion of refining and other kinds of industries, a very significant acceleration in their electricity consumption and generation. You can see again in this last column, over the last 10 years, the rate of electricity generation, growth in electricity generation, connected to the expansion of those industries I spoke about, but also connected to the use of air conditioning on a per capita basis. The Gulf states are actually among the highest users of air conditioning globally, and obviously that's a consequence of climate change, the impact of climate change in the Gulf, where you're seeing 50-degree temperatures now, or greater than 50-degree temperatures regularly in different parts of the region. So electricity generation is increasing. So the first win, in the words of the Saudi oil minister, is we want to cheapen electricity electricity production, given this expected increase in the costs of electricity, growth in electricity generation. The second win, and this is extremely important, and is probably the most important thing to understand of this, is that at the moment, the vast majority of this electricity generation is taking place through burning oil and gas. And you can see this again in the table. So what they are intending to do is to replace this, or to lessen this dependence on oil and gas, thereby freeing up more oil and gas for export. So it's about expanding the export of hydrocarbons through replacing some of that, or generating more electricity through renewables. So in this sense, there is no contradiction between the expansion of renewables and the increased production and export of oil and gas. In fact, they're intimately connected. One enables the other. And this is I think, really a central thing to understand, that we're not talking here about replacement. We're talking about an additive process. The growth actually of oil and gas, enabled through the rollout of renewables. So this is the second win, and again, this is all explicit. It's not, a speculative thing. It's spoken about in very open terms. And then the third win, and I know Natalie is here, or she was here earlier, Natalie, who has written around these kinds of questions about kind of the ways in which this green discourse reinforces the kind of image and power of the monarchies in the region. It is connected also with the ways in which they can brandish these targets, the expansion of solar and wind, as a means to market themselves as being leaders of this so-called green transition. They can say, look, we're not these old dinosaurs that are refusing to move away from oil and gas. We're actually trying to lead the world in solar and wind. And in fact, some of the biggest solar projects in the world are located in the Gulf. The biggest battery scheme at the moment is actually being undertaken in Saudi Arabia, and there are other examples as well. So it's about also brandishing these as kind of their green credentials. So these are the three wins: cheapening electricity, expanding oil and gas exports, and meeting their climate targets, etc. So, how can we summarize this in a bit more concretely? And I'll start to wrap up here. I've spoken about the triple win and this kind of expansion. Just coming back to this, the class structure of the Gulf states. One of the things that enables this to take place is the fact that labor is so cheap because of its character as of temporary migrant labor force. So the construction of these kinds of solar farms and etc. On a relative basis is cheaper in the Gulf than many other parts of the world. So again, not to leave aside this question of migrant work in thinking about how this sector is expanding. It's very interesting, and the article that I've noted here looks at this in more detail. Many of these projects, if not the bulk of them, in the Gulf are connected very deeply to those national oil companies like Aramco, like the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, in terms of the ownership of these schemes. So they're not happening in distinction from the oil industry, but actually being rolled out by the oil industry itself, which I think again is quite revealing. Interestingly, also, the East-East connections that I spoke about are also very evident in these schemes. This is not just simply the provision, for example, of solar panels, but actually in terms of jointly owning and operating these projects with Chinese and other East Asian investors. So it actually is further indication of these interdependencies that I've been speaking about in the oil industry. At a regional level, we can also, and by the way, the battery plant that I mentioned in Saudi Arabia is taking place, is a joint project with BYD, the big Chinese EV producer. So the other thing that's very, I think, revealing about this whole dynamic is that if you look at the wider region of the Middle East and renewable projects in places like Egypt and Morocco and Jordan and elsewhere, we see Gulf-based firms, particularly Saudi and Emirati firms, as the leading kind of actors in the wider industry at that regional level. So it's very important, I think, to think about how the Gulf's kind of internationalizing spreading, spreading regionally, is connected to the renewables expansion in North Africa and the wider Middle East, and indeed in the African continent and Central Asia. You can see a very significant footprint of Gulf-based firms in the renewable sector. Now, there's other aspects to this that I don't really have time to really turn to, but questions of kind of the false solutions, carbon capture, hydrogen, and so forth, that we do also see expanding in the Gulf region. And again, some of the biggest global schemes under development are located in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and elsewhere. Um, and associated with this is, I think, the outsized role of these national oil companies and the Gulf states in the making and obfuscation and obstruction of climate policy. We saw this very clearly in the recent COP in Brazil, where Saudi Arabia played a major role in blocking any kind of language around oil. We saw this in COP28, which was convened in Dubai and headed by the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Sultan Al Jaber. We can see this beyond the oil industry, beyond the COP summits, also in things like the global plastics negotiations around global plastics treaty, for instance, in Busan in South Korea, where Saudi Arabia again played this role in blocking language about capping the production of plastics, and played a very conscious role in shifting the discussion to one around recycling and etc., rather than actually limiting the production of plastics. So again, this is interesting because it shows that the involvement of these national oil companies in the whole of the downstream sectors as well, connected to oil. Now, obviously, what I'm saying here is not in any way meant to say, let the big Western companies off the hook, but just to say that the fact that these national oil companies are owned by these producer states does give them a different kind of role in the negotiation of policy, because these states, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, actually have a seat at the table when these negotiations and discussions are going on. Now, obviously, we saw in the Brazil COP how the prevalence and the largest number of fossil fuel lobbyists in any COP in attendance. But when the treaty is actually being negotiated and the ability to veto or change the language, the people in the room are governments like Saudi Arabia that are able to, I think, play that very obstructionist role. So it is something, I think, to think about in terms of dealing with this question of climate strategy more broadly. Final thing, just to say, basically, I've spoken about the policy making thing, but just to say that if we're thinking about this in terms of the questions of transition, I think it's very clear throughout the history of capitalism that energy transitions are not replacements. They are additive processes. And in fact, if you look historically at oil consumption, it's only at moments of deep global economic downturn that we see a decline, temporary decline in the consumption of oil. Last year was the largest consumption of oil, gas, and coal that in history. So this oil to coal transition certainly wasn't getting rid of coal; it was adding oil onto existing fossil fuel production. And I think this is very true in the case of this so-called green transition. That in other words, there is no green transition. It's about adding renewables onto a fossil fuel substrate. And I think the Gulf is an important test case for this argument, for all of the reasons that I've outlined. But I'll end it there, and then happy to talk about any of these things in more detail. Thank you.